Hello, and welcome to Ludonarrative Dissidents, a podcast with myself, James Wallace, Ross Payton, and Greg Stolze, in which each episode we take a deep dive on one particular role-playing game, dissecting it in the nicest way possible, taking it apart to see what makes it tick and sometimes what doesn't. This episode 2 of Season 2, being the third episode of Season 2, because why not? We're talking about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, and this is a game very close to my heart because I published the first edition through Hogshead Publishing, my company in the mid-90s to early 2000s, under license from Games Workshop. I had a lovely experience at a games convention just a few weeks ago, Tabletop Gaming Live in Manchester, where I was chatting with Chris McDowell, who designed Electric Bastion Land and Into the Odd. And I mentioned I'd published Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and he went, "Oh, I bought that at a games day." And I went, "Was that from a bunch of scruffy-looking people with a table covered in boxes running demo games?" He went, "Yes!" I said, "That was probably me. You probably literally pushed £20 into my hands, and I gave you a copy of the game." And it was his first role-playing game, and it's what started him off as a role player and then as a designer. And so this is a game that goes back a long way in the history of the hobby. It's laid down roots. It's been massively influential for quite a lot of people. It is still the most successful and most significant British role-playing game ever published. Shall I dive in and do some history of this thing?
As you wish. You're running this. I'm can't stop you, James.
Okay.
We're an impotent rump parliament for this episode.
Oh, and we know all about impotent parliaments right now. So this Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay obviously is a sequel, a sister publication to the massively successful Warhammer Fantasy Battle System game, which first came out in 1983 from Games Workshop. Published by Games Workshop, but kind of a co-production with Citadel Miniatures, which was a co-owned company run by Brian Ansell. Games Workshop was run by Ian Livingston and the British Steve Jackson. Second edition, I think, came out in 86, and then Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Roleplay was large enough at the time. But Games Workshop was also going through an interesting transition. Ian and Steve sold their shares to Brian Ansell, who took over running the company, relocated it to Nottingham, and refocused it almost entirely on miniatures and miniatures production, and therefore on the Warhammer brand and the very shortly to arrive Warhammer 40k brand.
Yeah, and since then, Warhammer Fantasy's had multiple editions. Our review is going to be focusing on the 4th edition, which came out in 2018, I believe. But yeah, I've known about Warhammer since the very beginning of my RPG. Oh, not the very beginning, but it was one of the first things I was sort of aware of. Yeah.
Is this the first game we've talked about that all three of us have played?
Okay, well, technically I've not actually played Warhammer Fantasy. I have played Warhammer Fantasy Scenarios, but using the Zweihander system, which is
Wait.
Yeah.
We found it, James. We found the system that you and I have played and Ross hasn't.
Yeah, Zweihander is Pathfinder to Warhammer Fantasy, or is to Warhammer Fantasy as Pathfinder is to D&D. It is,
good lord.
Yeah.
Yes. Though it should be clear that Warhammer FRP does not have an SRD or an open gaming license or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Zweihander is a love letter to it. And manages to be even thicker, even denser than it is. And Warhammer, I mean, by modern standards, it's not a chunky book. It's about 350 pages. But back in the day, that was a very, very substantial RPG. Most other games were coming in about 250.
I've got the 86 version in front of me, which was 364 pages, but it is in Smurf print. This is like 8-point type. It's brutal on my eyes.
They fitted a lot of stuff in, and as the guy who had to, some years later, actually do the index for it, yes, there is a huge amount of content in there.
My old character sheet's in here. Lord Wilhelm von Schadenfreude.
Brilliant. So as I said, it's a world, it's a game I have huge affection for. I've written extensively, obviously, for the original role-playing game. Also, I wrote 2.5 novels for within the Warhammer background, half a collaboration with Dan Abnett and Nick Abnett, I think she is now, his other half, and a bunch of short stories and comics and stuff. So it's a world that I know inside out, and you know, I don't exactly live there, but it occupies a substantial part of my my memory and my gaming memory. Its 4th edition is interesting. It's all 4 editions come from different publishers. It should say 1st edition was Games Workshop. 2nd edition was the Black Library, which was technically Games Workshop, but actually a separate company. 3rd edition was Fantasy Flight. And then 4th edition is Cubicle 7, the, at the time, British, now Irish games company. There are a couple of people who have worked on almost every edition. I believe Graham Davis has worked on every edition. Andy Law certainly worked on first edition, I think mostly doing artwork and maps with Hogshead, but was one of the 2 lead devs on 4th edition. John Hodgson was doing art for 1st edition and is in 4th edition. The aberration in there is 3rd edition, the Fantasy Flight one, which breaks away from the game's traditional setup, which is mostly a slightly old school percentile based system of mechanics, to replace it with a big dice pool system with custom dice and cards and very expensive accessories. And this was not a huge success.
What? From Fantasy Flight? Expensive accessories, you say?
I know. They made it a Fantasy Flight
What?
game. And the bits were lovely, and depending on who you talk to, they worked really well or they didn't work well at all. But that is now in the past, and it's the one that the fans don't tend to talk about. I have to admit, I never saw it. I never saw 2nd edition either. I wrote them a nice letter going, "Hi, really hope you do really well with this. If I can be of any help, pass on the addresses of any freelancers or artists like that." Tumbleweed. So
2nd edition, was that the 86 edition?
No, 86 is the 1st edition.
Okay.
And that lasted through.
I don't even know how I got this. I think this was a gift from someone in the 90s who wanted to run Warhammer and had more than one copy of it, which suggests how passionate people get about it. If you're giving your players a copy of this horse choker of a book.
I had a copy of 2nd edition that was... see, my introduction to Warhammer was through the war game, the miniatures game, which is obviously way more popular now. And, of course, all the Warhammer Fantasy is dwarfed by Warhammer 40K.
Ah, yes.
But through the fantasy game, I became aware of the skirmish game. I became aware of the setting, and then I started reading some of the novels. And there's certainly video games. And then 2nd edition came out in the 2004. Let's see here. Yeah. And so I picked up a copy and I read through it and I loved it. But then nobody I knew wanted to play it, and so it sat on a bookshelf. Yeah, I really like the Warhammer Fantasy is a game about being, instead of being like heroic adventurers like you were presumed to be in Dungeons & Dragons, about being like a picaresque sort of vagabond. Well, not necessarily a vagabond, but like someone who doesn't fit in and being bunched together and being thrown on these adventures. And its model is very much inspired by, Renaissance Europe, not medieval Europe, and far more German and continental, I guess you could say, than say, specifically English.
Specifically, it's the dying days of the Holy Roman Empire. That is what it is modelled on, right down to the elector counts and the provinces and all the rest of it. If you take a map of Europe at the time of the dying days of the Holy Roman Empire, in essentially the early Renaissance, and you look at the map of the Warhammer Fantasy world, clearly the latter is based on the former. There are towns that almost overlap. A lot of place names differ, but the map corresponds. And then the countries around the empire, as it's known: Tilia for Italy, Britannia for France, Estalia for Spain. I believe it's been a little while. Norska for the Scandinavian regions, and so on.
One of the things that immediately grabbed me about Warhammer Fantasy was just browsing through the second edition book and seeing the career system. And instead of having character classes like you do in D&D, you have careers, and you can change careers, and there are things that are not necessarily like heroic adventurer archetype. It's like
Rat catcher,
and grave robber. Yeah. Although some are more, but some are obviously like war priest and the dwarven slayer, which he that guy shows up on all the covers. Everyone loves the slayer.
He's got a look.
Yeah,
he does have a look.
It's interesting. He's on the cover of first edition, and then he or a close relative are then again on the cover of fourth edition. Fourth edition contains a lot of callbacks to specifically first edition. If you put the two, Greg, if you put the two next to each other, you will see not only is it the same Troll Slayer, he's in almost exactly the same position on the cover, in almost exactly the same pose. Yeah. Also, the fourth edition logo is very, very similar to the slightly revised logo that I commissioned for our edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, to the extent that I think they've, and this is no disrespect to the graphic designers at Cubicle 7, I think they have traced the outlines and then done their own version. It's a great logo. It stands up enormously. The other thing, just to drop in at this point, is that within the continuity of Games Workshop, the Warhammer world no longer exists. It blew up a few years ago. They blew it up. The fantasy battle game is not available as I speak, although there are reports that it will be coming back in some form or another. No one's quite sure. But at the moment, the world is gone, and with it, any royalties I may have seen on my novels.
It is now called. Yeah, they had this event, and now that it's. The fantasy has been transformed into the Age of Sigmar, which is very more heavy metal album cover inspired than, say, old Holy Roman Empire. It is very fantastic and magical and like floating through space and that kind of thing.
And
I don't know very much about
distinctive IP as well is the other thing. It's stuff that Games Workshop can trademark and sue people if they make anything that looks exactly like it, which when you're doing a fantasy game based around dwarves and elves and halflings and orcs and goblins is a lot harder. There is an ongoing argument about who originated the idea of orcs as greenskins with the projecting lower jaw with the up-pointing fangs, but certainly the fantasy company that popularized it seems to have been Games Workshop, and then a number of others adopted that, and it's become, within gaming, certainly the generic look for what an orc looks like. Of course, it's not. If you go back to D&D, the Monster Manual, orcs are literally humans with the heads of pigs. They're completely different. So Workshop originated an awful lot of the distinctive imagery. Other people borrowed it. Games Workshop discovered that they couldn't do anything about that. And several decades later, blew up the world.
But that won't stop them from trying.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, as an aside, like they're doing a parallel thing in Warhammer 40K, where instead of having like a term like Space Marine, which is not trademarkable because it's a very generic kind of thing, they're now called Astartes, and now instead of the guardsmen, they're Astrum Militarium or something like that. It's all like made up, vaguely Latin sounding. But they're all unique in terms that they can trademark. And now the Astartes are no longer just Astartes. There's Primus, Astartes. I have friends who play 40K. I don't know if you can tell that.
I'm asking for a friend of mine whether I can trademark Astartes.
When you're running a company that's worth several $1 billion, you have to think about this kind of thing. For, if you're running a small company out of your bedroom, this may be less of a priority. But when you have massive pension funds as your shareholders, as Games Workshop does, you have to protect your IP. You have to protect your value, or you, I believe, can be taken to court. So that's one of the reasons. We're getting off the point. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, what it does. The career system is really lovely, and 4th edition combines the best bits of 1st and 2nd edition, the way those two work. The diversity of it, from the ground down and grungy right up to the... you can't be the Emperor as such, but you can be advisors to the royal court, you can be ambassadors, you can be knights, you can be there are heroic types in there, but you've got to work your way up to them. And the great thing about Warhammer, and the thing that keeps me coming back to it as a background, is often it's more fun not to. It is more fun to struggle in the mud, struggle day to day for survival. From lurching from adventure to adventure in a world that does not have any concept of the idea of adventuring heroes. They regard you as tramps, pretty much, or travelers, or peddlers, or whatever. And it's at the time, 1986. This was new. Games were about the heroes. And they were an awful lot of them were power fantasies. Paranoia had come out, had upset that apple cart. But Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was the first one that went, this is a fantasy game, and you're going to have a big axe and a big sword, and everyone's going to treat you like shit. And
fantasy dirtbags.
Fantasy dirtbags. It's the first grimdark role-playing game.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
All right.
Says it right on the cover. It has done every single, 1, 2, and 4 certainly use the phrase, a grim world of perilous adventure at the bottom of the front cover. And they mean it. This is a game in which,
all right.
It's not just the dwarves that are nasty, brutish, and short.
As a Warhammer, not just a historian of Warhammer, but yourself a historical artifact of Warhammer, how do you respond to the way I heard it described once is Warhammer is the game you start thinking it's D&D and you gradually find out you're playing Call of Cthulhu.
Yes, that's the other thing, because there are the horror elements in here. And it's a game that wears its influences on its sleeve. It obviously borrows, as D&D did, massively from Tolkien. But it borrows perhaps more than D&D did from Michael Moorcock.
I would also say Fritz Leiber.
Fritz Leiber as well, but Moorcock over here was a colossal influence. You could find his books they were in print constantly in the 80s. You could pick them up very cheaply secondhand. Pretty much everyone who was a gamer had read Moorcock, and this whole idea of lore and chaos. And Warhammer takes the idea, Warhammer Battle System, and also the Fantasy Roleplay takes the D&D alignment system and throws it out the window. Just goes, yeah, sure, the lore and stuff like that, but chaos. Chaos is the one that's going to win. And what the books never say, but as you read through them, you become aware, and this is the reason they blew up the world, is that the good races, and these are never clearly defined, the non-chaotic races are fighting a rearguard action because they're going to lose. Chaos is going to win. Its ultimate victory is inevitable. And the moment you grasp that, as either a player or as a GM, your campaign takes on a whole different tone.
So that sounds like both sort of Norse mythology and Delta Green.
Yeah.
It's... you're not going to win. You're just going to lose later.
Yeah, pretty much. And, there's a chance you may personally become infected by chaos and mutated by chaos. And mutations are interesting, and you'll probably try and hide them, not just from, from the people around you, but also from other party members, because there's a bounty on mutants. And also, mutants are unclean and will infect other people. But there are powers. Chaos is seductive. And there are the 4 chaos gods. There's Nurgle, the god of disease and uncleanliness. There's Tzeentch, the changer of ways. Slanesh, who's sensuous pleasure. And I'm forgetting one.
Korn.
Korn. Of course, the blood god. Yes.
Yeah. I think it's instructive to the couple of games I've played in the Warhammer Fantasy setting, which are actually Warhammer Fantasy scenarios, Rough Night at the Three Feathers and A Night of Blood, both of which are basically the setup is you're all traveling, it's night, it's dark, it's stormy, there's an inn up ahead, and you need to get some shelter, and then obviously things happen. So that's the stereotypical Warhammer scenario. Rather than
as you slog miserably through the cold, wet mud towards a hovel you can see sputtering, greasy smoke emerging from its smokestack, indicating that other similar wretches are crouched within.
Yeah, it's just trying to find. Warhammer Fantasy seems to be much more a game of misadventure, and like again, picaresque. It's going through, not being like sent on noble quests. It's like, well, we need to make some coin or we're going to starve to death, and then stumbling into a mystery or a situation you have to precariously survive. And the mechanics support this because a lot of the things we're talking about, there's corruption mechanics, there's literally fate mechanics.
There are a lot of ways for your character to be destroyed or ruined in some fashion.
Critical hit tables,
Yeah, you can lose parts of your body. It's not necessarily destroyed. I mean, that'll probably happen at some point. But yes, to end an adventure or an encounter worse off than they started it. So it's constant scrabble to maintain your position within the world, which is probably fairly low to start with.
So, I mean, you can kind of draw it like it's about the narrative of a doomed character, but because of their fate points, they get to survive a while, and so it's seeing how long they can delay the inevitable horrible demise that they will face from any number of threats.
Yeah. Should we talk about fate points for a bit?
I should mention the system is a percentile system like Call of Cthulhu, although it is distinctly different in a lot of ways because you have skills and trappings, which can modify things. And for fourth
talents,
edition,
not trappings.
Or talents, trappings are items and things for particular careers. It also uses one thing for critical hits, the doubles system, which a lot of other percentile systems have used, which is like an 11, a 22, etc. Are criticals. Let's see.
It's just mathematically nice. It's 10% of outcomes. Bada bing.
The thing I really like before we get to the fate is the combat. I'm really intrigued by this because instead of like in second edition, and in previous editions, you rolled to hit, and if you missed, you missed. But in this one, they have this, in the core mechanics, the advantage system. So you roll to attack someone, they roll to defend. If you win the attack, then you inflict damage based on your margin of success. But if the defender wins, they get an advantage, which gives them a bonus to attack you. And advantages can stack up until they're hit, or they take damage or they suffer a condition of some kind. So there's, which I find a very interesting change of pace. So every attack has some sort of change in the battlefield. It's not just hit or I miss and nothing happens. Like someone's at least going to get an advantage to give them a better chance to attack. Also, with the way the damage works, it seems characters can't take very many hits before they're down. So I don't, it would be interesting to play a 4th edition game to see how, but it does seem very complex too, because you have to measure.
Yeah. But the way they're tracking advantage is, you just throw tokens in the middle of the table. And I'm like, that's the way to do it. That is tactile, tangible, easy to manage.
Fast and dirty.
And only one side is going to have advantage at a time. It's just a question of how much, right? Yeah. So that's functional. I did find the system extremely finicky, and not always in a fun way. The thing that caught me with the classes, I'm like, this is clearly a British game because you're in this class and you are very unlikely to ever get out of your class.
That's a change from previous editions, I think, isn't it?
No, you can change.
But it's hard.
I remember in 2nd edition reading the rules that like you could exit into other careers easily.
Yes, that is what I remember is that, it's like, oh, do I want to stay a rat catcher or do I want to become a muckraker or a beggar? And it's all about, there was this intricate framework of that you had to path out your future career. It's like, okay, what I really wanted to do is get to this one where you're like a double pistolier, but the only way you can get there from the real lower classes is you have to start out as a rat catcher. It's like, now, if you want to eventually be a witch hunter, then you got to start out in this other
Yes, and it was never flow charted at any point. It was never clear exactly what.
Oh, I'm
what
sure
your
someone has.
Oh, someone has, but it was never in the book. But yes, certainly in first edition, it was easier to switch. And I seem to recall reading somewhere in fourth, you can switch between them. But the idea, fourth edition is much more about you can move upwards through the classes, and there was much less of that within the earlier editions.
It takes like a boatload of XP, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. They used to be jobs, essentially, and now they're much more callings or something that you're intended to kind of stick at. But there is, as you can probably gather, a wide diversity of things, different ranks, different ranges, different social classes as well. And there is a section on social class within the game because, as you say, Greg, it's a British game. We're very acutely aware of that kind of thing. And so a number of games have been around, a noble and their hangers-on and acolytes and assistants and people who just kind of follow them, really.
So, since we're talking about careers, we should probably talk about character creation because that's obviously a very important part of this game. Because
was I the only one who who made a character?
I went through the steps, but I didn't actually write everything down because it's a very detailed system.
It is a very detailed system, and I'm not sure that it's always. I mean, I'm like, this is finicky but fun. But I think it could have been simpler without losing the fun. I don't know.
Well, no, I definitely have this whole thing about Warhammer themed Warhammer based role playing games because it's not just this, but also they did a whole bunch of I think Fantasy Flight did a whole bunch of 40K RPGs and they're all bogged down in just stat names that are legacy effects from the skirmish games. But also just being very complex and crunchy games. And it's like, I have a lot of friends I think I could get into the Warhammer setting, but they're going to look at this big, bulky character creation system and not get into it. I mean, there's also a discussion to be had about the legacy of being the fourth edition of a game that started in the 80s and wanting to be at least somewhat backwards compatible. And
yes.
Because it's in fourth edition, they have dexterity, agility, and initiative, which all cover very similar things for a character. It's you could not just simplify that into one attribute, or weapon. I mean, weapon skill and ballistic skill being attributes instead of skills. But there's also an interesting thing here about how it rewards you for randomly rolling things instead of choosing things. So
I wound up with 120 extra experience points at the beginning because I was just willing to take whatever the dice gave me with my human bounty hunter with surprisingly low dexterity.
Which puts you 2 or 3 sessions ahead. 1 or 2 sessions ahead of the other players because you get 75 per session, 75 to 100 per session, and then another 100 for finishing an adventure usually. So,
totally worth it because to me having a random messy character is that's a feature as much as a bug.
Yeah, it's certainly in the spirit of the setting too, to be a rat catcher with a bunch of personality flaws rather than being a wood elf sniper or wizard, an
optimized character. Yes.
Yeah, it goes
back,
goes back I think to the early roots of the game and some of the influences on the game. And Games Workshop, at the time they started working on this, was a games distributor. They had the UK rights for RuneQuest. In fact, we're republishing RuneQuest in the UK. They were republishing I think they were republishing Traveller. And it's one can see there's an influence here from the original Traveller character generation system that works you through kind of various ages. And of course, legendarily, you can die during character generation in Traveller.
That seems more like the class hopping thing seems to look like Traveller character generation to me. And again, the class hopping is fun. And it's this is my progress of, first I was a bounty hunter, and then from that I got a job as a river warden, and then from that I did this other thing. I became a protagonist for a while, but I didn't really like the work, and it provides a narrative framework that is more intricate and interesting and detailed than, well, I started out as a first level fighter and now I'm a 5th level fighter.
Yeah, 100%. There's also, I mean, it does sort of, especially if everyone uses random character creation, it can, because of the setting, put certain strains on starting groups. Like there definitely needs to be a session 0 to sort of figure out, especially if because this is a game that is very like, wood elves are not like really accepted, or like if you're a dwarf or a halfling, if you're anything other than human, you're going to have some difficulties in mainstream society and vice versa. So like,
I mean, the fact that the game needed disadvantages for hatred and animosity and prejudice, I'm like,
or even certain careers, like a zealot with like a agitator, you know, like someone, or there are a lot of careers that are pretty, you know, or like a bounty hunter versus a criminal. Like, yeah, there are some combos that are gonna have to be sort of like, it could be, if you're not an experienced GM or your players are not like willing to sort of like work with everybody, you know, then there could be some tension, you know. But on the other hand, you get some really interesting characters with this. So
yes. So would we agree that what it does is, I feel like I can sum it up in the word Baroque. The art is very intricate, displaying a setting where the aesthetics are very intricate, and, you know, everything has dozens of little skulls and filigrees all over everything, and the mechanics are similarly very detailed and intricate. There's not an attempt made. This is not an Art Deco set of mechanics. This is a Rococo set of mechanics.
Yeah.
And I feel that probably from, you know, and that was the style at the time. Everything back then was really this finicky simulation. And so I think they have tried to simplify it and make more of the complexity be emergent than just foundational. But at the same time, there's only so far that you can simplify Warhammer before it loses its essential Warhammer nature.
Yes. And this does, yes, very much so. And this does nod an awful lot back to not only its first edition, but the battle game that it's based on, not only in the stat block, which in first edition was very closely based on the battle game stat block, is recognizably derived from that in this. But some of the rules choices as well, and the way it does stuff. There's no acknowledgement of progression in roleplay design from the last 15 or 20 years here. There's no failing forward. There is a half page or a page of setting up session 0 and making sure your players are comfortable, and they don't talk about the X card specifically, I believe, but you know, there's more than a nod in that direction. And
yes.
But that's about as far as it goes in terms of modernity. Structurally, this feels like an old-school role-playing game, which is interesting because back in the day, first edition, even in 1986, felt old-school. It did not feel bang up to date, with the exception of fate points. I'm going to digress for a moment. Greg, you asked if we generated a character. I didn't generate a character for this system because I am a character in this system. I actually appear, or an analogue of me appears on page 93. Jacob Wallace, bargeman who sank his forking barge, which, if I can digress for a second, back in the day, because it's interesting, this relates back to something else that we were saying. It feels like a game in which characters aren't very long-lived, but actually it's created, and it was always designed for campaign play, and in fact has one classic campaign, the Enemy Within campaign, one of the great campaigns, which I republished and made some changes to in Hogshead, but Cubicle 7 has republished, redesigning large chunks of it and turning it into the thing that it had a rushed ending. The final 2 volumes of the original campaign by, admittedly, Ken Ralston and Carl Sargent, both great names, given short deadlines and insufficient briefs, because Games Workshop was moving away from role-playing games, and so they needed to rush this stuff out to conclude the campaign. Cubicle 7 has gone back, has reworked those, has restructured the whole thing and turned it into the campaign it always should have been. So if you visited The Enemy Within before, but haven't seen the 4th edition version, it's really worth it. It's very much a campaign game. But anyway, in the Hogshead version, and indeed in the Games Workshop version before it, second book, Death on the Reich, you've blown up a castle, or a castle has been destroyed, and you're going through the rubble, and you find a letter in there that says, there's something weird going on in the city of Middenheim, which is several hundred miles away. And then Volume 3, Power Behind the Throne, which is a masterpiece of an adventure. Oh my lord. Begins, so you arrive in Middenheim. And that WFRP is not a game in which you pick up trails like that and follow them. That's a very D&D thing. It needed something. Also, the other problem with Death on the Reich is that people acquire a river barge, and many of them fall in love with river trading and beating up river pirates and just having a lovely time on the river, getting rich, which is not the way the game should go.
No, well, and they've fixed that in 4th edition, because between every adventure you lose all your money.
There is now downtime between the adventures. If I can just finish the anecdote, and then we can talk about downtime in a second. So I wrote a new 12-page segment to bridge that gap. Pretty much the first thing of which happens is somebody sets light to your barge, and it sinks, and people go, "Oh dear, what a terrible tragedy! Well, we'll get you a new barge if you run this errand to Middenheim for us." You see the point of that. There was a British fanzine called Critical Miss. It's still available. It's still up on the net. But round about the year 2000, the editor Johnny Nexus wrote an extended screed called "James Wallace Ruined My Character's Life," in which he basically ranted about how he'd been having this lovely time as a river trader, and then I'd sunk his barge. And this came into the Hogshead office, and we looked at it, and I went, "It's all right, I'll do an official reply." So I did an official reply on Hogshead headed notepaper, which began, "Yes, I sank your fucking barge," continued for another 500 words or so, and finished with the words, "Go on, buy another barge, I'll fucking sink that too." This went, by the standards of the time, pre-broadband internet, viral within the WFRP community, to the extent that I now appear in the 4th edition rulebook as Jacob Wallace, bargeman who sank his forking barge. Forking, not fucking, you'll note, and the quote is actually about why you shouldn't fork your barge. Because that's the way you'll sink it by accident. So I'm a character within the game. But that does bring us neatly onto the subject of downtime, which is new.
Yes.
I don't believe it was in the Fantasy Flight edition. But that's a major structural change, and this idea that the campaign is not just a single story that you tell continuously as if it was a TV serial. There are these gaps between the adventures. And did Coyote and Crow do the same thing?
I think so.
I think it did. This is an acknowledgement of modern game design. The breathing space, the kind of the recalibration of the campaign, the talking to your players as players and going, is this going where you're enjoying? Are you having a good time? Can we rebalance this thing? What should we do next? But
and it probably comes out of Pendragon. Pendragon.
Is it as far back as that? Yes, you're right.
And you saw it in Ars Magica too.
Yeah. Also, Delta Green. We'll see it in our next game, Red Markets. There's a lot of games that have a Heart, the City Beneath. I believe Spire does too. There's a lot of games that have a downtime.
What are you doing to try and desperately recover from the traumatizing damage inflicted on you? And, how are you trying to arrest the downward spiral of your life as a player character?
Well, it all began when someone sunk my barge, apparently. So the downtime has events, and then you get to choose endeavors. So events are literally random events. And there's a D100 table. I would think eventually you would probably want to, if you're doing a campaign, you probably want to modify those or add some new ones in, because there's 20 or 30 events. Yeah, you're going to go through them. Then there's endeavors, which are actually kind of, a goal system. Like you get to do something with your character.
One of which is put my money in the bank so that I don't drink it all away.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to actively not be a wastrel.
Yeah, true. You can, elves literally have to go out of their way to spend one of their, you get multiple endeavors. Well, depending on the length, it's like 1 week per endeavor, up to 3 endeavors, no matter how long it is between adventures. The elves have to spend one of their endeavors to basically report back to their people or attend to their elven responsibilities. But you can do everything to train an animal.
It's the price they pay for being better than everyone else.
You can invent something. You can train. There's also class endeavors.
Or just try to make some money.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so there's I do like that. I do like that because that, helps. Like what am I even adventuring for if not to actually do something? Other than just, survive or solve the mystery.
Right.
To make some change to the game setting in some small way. So yeah, that was a really cool addition.
Have we covered what the game does and how it does it? Because we have touched on its percentile mechanics and many fiddly subsystems. And I would also add, this is one of those games where it's like the game really wants you to learn the mechanics, even if you are not playing a wizard, which in every game, it's like, oh, if you want to play a wizard, you'll get all these cool powers, but you gotta learn a whole separate sub-game of manipulating this, that, and the other damn thing. But in this, it's like, okay, I want to optimize my character to do critical injuries. And, you should optimize your character to do armor penetration. And that's how we'll be effective in combat. And you need to understand which talents you need and which combat maneuvers click into those talents like Legos syncing up. And it's a lot. It's not freeform.
Well, you can freeform it. You can just blunder into it with a mismatched crew of people who happen to meet each other on the road. And I would say that's probably more in the spirit of it and probably more fun. Optimizing the game, I don't think it intends you to do that. Or at least not at the start. You can as your character grows and develops, but certainly not right at the beginning. Fate throws you together. Fate points keep you alive.
I think that's a good transition into how it does what it does is through the fate point mechanic because it gives narrative agency to the player characters. And this is a very lethal system in a lot of ways. Both combat is very deadly and there's like we mentioned, the corruption mechanics. You can mutate, you can go insane. But fate, which
a lot of diseases.
A lot of diseases. Yeah. But they've greatly expanded the fate mechanics in 4th edition. There's now literally 4 meta currencies in the game. Fate and Fortune, I believe, are from previous editions, but they also have Resilience and Resolve. Yeah, and it's you use them for different things. The fate points are the most important because you can permanently burn a fate point to save your character from certain death.
Yes, it's like a narrative veto. It's like, no, I defy that this world has crushed my puny character.
Yeah.
Even though it's very clear that this is a world that crushes puny characters.
Yeah. And this was one of the first games to do that, to give the players the agency to take control of the narrative away from the GM for a moment and go, as you said, no, this is something different happens at that point. It wasn't, I think, the very first. I think that was James Bond 007. Which is 84 or 85, but this first edition was 1986. And the core idea of fate points is almost unchanged in 4th edition. But then they spin it out into all these the variations upon it and other things that you can do with it.
It is interesting to note that humans actually start with 2 fate and the other species do not. But they all get extra points to allocate between fate and resilience.
Yeah. Can we just make the point
fate
that
and resilience,
humans are a bit shit? I mean, mechanically, yes, they're the dominant species and they get huge social advantages within the background because there are more of them than anyone else. But mechanically, they start at simply a slightly lower tier. They have fewer special abilities. And so the fate points is partly a way to kind of buoy that up, that humans are luckier.
Now, I think there's something to say. So your fate is, again, a permanent thing. Once you spend a fate point, it's gone forever. But you get a number of fortune points at the start of each session equal to your fate.
Yes. So as you burn that out, it's a little bit of a miniature death spiral inside the larger death spiral that is just the game. And it's that's fun. That it's like it's one of those very limited resources where you're like, oh, but if I spend this now, I won't have it later when I might really need it. And I'm sure more than one Warhammer character has died with fate points unspent because they're like, oh well, no, I think I'll pull this out just on the virtues of my own abilities and go. Oops. So yeah, so that's a tremendous psychological blow to the players.
There is that. Yeah. Oh God, what if I need it later? Well, you're about to get cut in half by a troll, so maybe now's the time to spend. But I find it interesting that they have these two, like, you also have resolve, which is based on your current resilience, and again, you can spend your resilience you can burn that off as well for different advantages. But it does seem a bit finicky to have, because there's only specific things you can do with each one. Like fortune you can use for rerolls, resilience you can use to deny mutations, or choose a number instead of rolling a test. You can just choose to have a certain number. And then resolve, you can be immune to psychology. You can ignore all modifiers from critical wounds, or remove one condition, and not all at once. That each use costs 1 point. So for this edition, I feel like you could have simplified that, just give people more fortune points, and just let them.
Well, but I mean, once you start simplifying stuff, you can. Where do you stop?
I guess that's the question. Like, I mean, do you feel like these are too many meta currencies, Greg?
I feel like the people who are playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay came for. They want a control panel with a whole bunch of buttons and levers, and this gives it to them.
Huh, that's interesting. James, did you agree with that?
I think so, yes. And I think it's also the thing that you can be going, what I really need now is a resilience point. And I've still got my fate points, but I need a resilience point. So it's kind of, there's a narrative tone to it, which I think is quite... Fate points are great, but they're a bit of a blunt object. It's
not quite the helplessness generator that Red Markets is, but it's still...
Yeah, there's elements of that. And remember, this is a game that, 4th edition came out in 2018. It's almost a 5-year-old game. So,
that's true.
It's too complicated for my taste, I must admit. And I would probably just paste on the fate point thing. Because the other thing I found was that people forgot fate points. They forgot that they existed. If they weren't already familiar with the game, if they were playing a one-shot or even a short campaign, they would simply forget the mechanic. To have 3 or 4 different things that you've not only got to remember exist, but you've got to remember how they work and what they do. That's, for me, or at least for the kind of people I play with, that's too much.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
I told you that I have the old character sheet from the 2nd edition game I played. In big letters at the top of the sheet in red ink, I wrote, "Remember luck!" ! All in capitals.
Yeah. Honestly, I do think that's why I like Fate, the role-playing game system, because there's only one meta currency, and it's very much about spending and earning those, and that is, there is a certain amount of I feel at some point I would like to do some sort of discussion about how much of a role-playing game do you actually play? Rule book has this many pages, this many rules, but when I run games, I often I'm using maybe anywhere from 80% to 10% of the rules, but it's seldom 100% of the rules.
Well, I mean, what percentage of the keys on your keyboard do you need for any particular sentence you type? I mean, it's not all of them. Q, X, and Z aren't getting a lot of love, but if I need to write Sphinx of Quartz, hear my vow, I'm glad they're there. Sometimes you need those edge case rules.
Yes. I have never used the key that has that weird little kind of right angle on it that's usually up at top left. I've no idea what that's for. But yeah, at some point. But it's nice to have it there so you can choose to include it or not. And I'm sure there are some people who do games that are based around this stuff and some people who just, strip it out and don't use it at all.
I mean, that's something that it says in the book. It's like, maybe you're going to want to have a bunch of diseases. Many groups find that having everyone be slightly sick all the time is super fun for them in a masochistic way. And other groups just are like, no, I don't need to know about so-and-so's bloody flux. That's not what I'm gaming for. So, I mean, there is always that aspect of, in a system this complicated, you're like, yeah, no one's gonna ring every bell and blow every whistle, but they want to have. There was some famous European cynic who's like, it's not enough to be seated alone at the table. I have to have empty chairs around me. And so it's a little bit like that, it's not enough that I'm just using the the psychology rules. I have to also be disregarding the poison and disease rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. Unless you're running like a Nurgle themed adventure, then you probably
and this is not for everybody. A lot of people are just like, just give me the most simple, straightforward fade into the background until I need chaos to screw up the plot lines system, and that's just as legitimate as this.
Yeah.
But, people, there are some people who love a gigantic greasy hamburger with 90 condiments on it, and there are some people who love a simple piece of sushi. And they're both right.
Yeah.
And I think this is definitely a greasy hamburger system.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the talents, there's well over I think 160 talents in the game, and a lot of them have very specific rules. They're not so there's a lot of mechanical complexity in this, but it's the talents are optional. You don't have to pick them. You don't have to pick the ones you don't like.
Yeah. Conversely to that, it's not one of those big, thick rule books that has 100 pages of spells and 100 pages of monsters. It's spell list, and I think this partly emphasizes the comparatively small role that magic plays in the Warhammer background, that those who have it are enormously powerful, but not very many do have it. There's less than 30 pages of spells. There's less than 20 pages of monsters. And yes, of course, there are separate books for magic and separate books for separate bestiaries. But for your core book to go in that light on things that are usually at the heart of fantasy role-playing game rule books, I found enormously refreshing, because I am so tired of spell lists. I've said this before about other games, and it was delightful to go, how many pages am I going to have to skip now? Oh, wow, 28 pages. That's great.
As opposed to the 60 pages of classes and careers.
Yes. But it's all about, it's defining your broad character options rather than individual powers.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also, the career system is also a great bit of world building, especially for me, when I was learning about Warhammer as a setting, just browsing through the list of careers in Warhammer 2nd Edition, oh, okay, this is what this setting is like. All right, I get it. I think I get the vibe.
Yeah. Can I just say, the rulebook does an amazing job of world building. As I say, it's a world I know inside out, but flipping through it, almost your introduction are a sequence of double-page spreads of new artwork with descriptions about what they're illustrating, and ongoing narrative with the characters that we recognise from the cover. That troll snare, he's back. He's a regular character. Clearly, you're following an adventuring party through this, and then once you're through that, there's a little bit of the world building, and then you're into the characters. Every single character, the whole thing is just there's quotes, in-world quotes from characters. So the duelist class has a couple of, not only quotes from a duelist, but quotes from people about duelists. It gives you a really refreshing sense of what it's like to be in the world, and it doesn't need huge examples of play. I do bemoan the fact that there isn't an introductory adventure in the rule book. I always think...
I was kind of surprised, actually, when I looked through and I was like, what? They do have a starter set. They do have free adventures you can get as PDFs, but I feel like that's... especially for a game like this, they should have tagged on another 20 pages.
Yes, just to give a shape of the kind of stories that you're expected to tell. But the world building, the atmosphere and tone of the place, as well as the geography and key citizens, as well, the important people, the way the races react to each other, is all... You're not bashed over the head with it, but it's all colourful, and quite a lot of it is quite funny as well. Warhammer WFRP has always had this tone of a mix of dark humour, quite bleak humour, and stupid puns. And 4th edition carries
page 58 with the joke from the priest of the death god saying, and that is why in the midnight hour we chant our god's name more. I'm like, they clearly know. They clearly know what age cohort is buying this game. The hat on page 90 is amazing. It is a grubby leather cap with a slot in the front for some reason, a spoon. And this
was the fashion at the time.
Well, I think it's a peddler. I think they're a spoon seller because they've got a spoon and fork on their apron.
Yeah, so she is selling spoons. She's just this is who gonna save the empire is spoon gal.
Just as an aside, one of the things, I ran a Warhammer 40k adventure, and my friend, which has a very similar aesthetic in some ways, and my friend Campbell is just obsessed with his preacher character having a book on a stick, why are all these places, who's lighting all these candles in all these chapels and places we're going to? He's like, well, it's just, don't worry about that part. I do want to mention, though, I was reading also discussions about Warhammer Fantasy, aside from reading the rules, and I found interesting, we're talking about the magic rules. There are some very important differences in editions. Apparently, magic was much more dangerous to use in 2nd edition and much less helpful to player characters. And in 4th edition, apparently, it's a lot safer to cast, not without risks. There are possibilities of misfires and critical fumbles and whatnot. But also the magic is actually more beneficial. So I don't know how that. So I find that an interesting what a magic character can do changes from edition to edition.
It does. In 1st edition, the magic system was incomplete. In fact, the 1st edition rulebook makes repeated reference to the book Realms of Sorcery. You have to remember this is a book that came out in 1986. We finally published the 1st edition of Realms of Sorcery in 2001. Literally 15 years later. But yeah, and because at the time we were working closely with Games Workshop and we were playing in their playground, it had to hew very closely to what they were doing with magic in the battle system at the time. And so a lot of it is about the colleges of magic and their spells and taken directly from the game. Though there's hedge magic and a bunch of others. And I'm waxing nostalgic on a book that's been out of print for 20 years. I'll shut up.
I do want to mention, there actually, I forgot to mention when we were talking about meta currencies, there's technically a 5th one in that you can always take a corruption point.
Yes.
To reroll.
Gods of Chaos, save me!
Which I found quite thematic, and I like that. Even if I think they could have simplified the number of meta currencies they had, I do like that.
Anyway, so we've talked at length about what it does and how it does it.
So how people play it is obviously our next question. And I feel like it being the least experience in the Warhammer Fantasy RPG.
Don't you mean how people will play it?
Yeah. So yeah, how do people play? Because I feel like it seems like the from reading various 2e books that it is premise as being again, you're a group of people thrown together by fate. You could be a beggar, you could be a merchant, all these relatively common people, but eventually we're gonna go and you can have misadventures by at an inn and all these other things, but eventually, as the campaign goes on, you're going to go some dungeon crawling, you're going to fight some monsters, and the monsters are going to get bigger and scarier. And so I don't know. Does it become D&D at a certain point? Is there a danger of that? Is that
I don't think so. I haven't followed all the supplements for 4th edition, but certainly when we were doing 1st edition, our intention was very much that it not become D&D. We had a strict moratorium on introducing new monsters. We said the monsters that were in the game were basically the monsters that were in the world. And you could introduce a new monster if you really had to, but do not feel obliged to. We also had a thing that there were no accurate maps of the old world. Every single map was inaccurate in some way. I don't know if they've adhered to that, but I noticed that all the maps are slightly different once again. And again, in 1st edition, there was an introductory adventure, and it led straight into the Enemy Within campaign. It was the prelude for the Enemy Within, and you're instructed at the end, now go out and buy Shadows over Bokenhafen.
Well, that's Games Workshop.
That's pretty much Games Workshop. So, what was it actually? Anyway, that was the intention. So it was set up very much for campaign play, although there are a range of classic short adventures, and you mentioned Rough Night at the Three Feathers, which I think has been printed. Certainly we reprinted it. It was originally in White Dwarf, which of course was published by Games Workshop, and which they used to support and publicise the game. But then we republished it in one of our collected supplements, and now it's out for 4th edition as well in a different form. It's, the game works of both. You get the richness of the game out of the long play. You can delve into the lore, and there is a lot of lore. It's built up over the years, but even when we took it on, there was a great deal of background to take on and understand. And since the Black Library has been around publishing fiction set in that world, I don't think they still publish Warhammer Fantasy fiction, but up to the point where they blew up the world, they certainly did. And there's an enormous amount, and historical stuff, and exploring the different areas of the world. There's an awful lot you can delve into.
It does sound like a lot of the published stuff, and I haven't played any of the big published adventures. I've just heard about how good they are, and they're basically like dirtbag fantasy techno thrillers, right? That, this is about you finding out that, so-and-so is extremely corrupt. So-and-so is being manipulated by the Skaven. Or, so-and-so is actually a chaos cultist.
Yeah.
So that this is not a typical D&D scenario, which is that, dragon in the hole in the ground, and you go in there and just stab, and dig them on out. Take all that gold in the cart. And this is, I don't know why I was doing that voice, but
neither do we.
But this is more of you're going to find out that as cynical as you are, you're not cynical enough.
Yeah, pretty much. Certainly the first 4 volumes of The Enemy Within, there's no dungeon bashing as such. There's some stuff in the sewers, there's some stuff in a castle, but then there is a dungeon, or there was a dungeon in Empire in Flames, which was the final volume.
Well, I mean, a dungeon. But what do we mean by a dungeon? I mean, I'm like, a sewer sounds a lot like what I consider a dungeon to be, which is a constrained locale where the shape of the area determines a lot of tactical choices, and a lot of it is about, we're going to run around on this stage like people playing paintball.
Yeah, stuff that's
And
a lot
that's part of
closer
the fun.
to squad-based war games or Hero Quest or
Yeah.
Chainmail or that kind of thing. Yeah. Yes, there were little bits of that, and back in the day there were sets of miniatures designed specifically for each adventure that came out because Games Workshop was making its money off miniatures. It was and ran by a man who was obsessed by miniatures and was transcendently good at them, Brian Ansell. Absolute miniatures genius. If anyone is interested in the extended history of the early days of Games Workshop, I wrote a piece for Zones of Control, the MIT book on war games generally, a few years ago that basically traces the history from the foundation of Games Workshop up to about the year 2010 or so, and goes some way to explain how it's possible for, even back then where the company was only worth about $150 million, that was still about $149 million more than other war games companies put together. They were this extraordinary aberration, and it's a really interesting story of how they got there. But they were very miniatures focused, and role-playing games don't traditionally sell a lot of miniatures, which is one of the reasons why it was first sidelined, pushed aside into a second studio, Flame Studios, and then ultimately dropped, just in time for me to pick it up with Hogshead. So there had to be elements like that in a number of the games, and some of them conspicuously don't have that. Power Behind the Throne does not have that.
I think there is this, like, the Warhammer Fantasy setting. I mentioned the D&D stuff, but, like, we've also mentioned Call of Cthulhu, and so, like, it seems a lot of the adventures are in the investigative mode.
Yes.
Uncovering chaos cults or vampires.
You come across a threat and you investigate it not because it's going to make you rich, but because you cannot ignore it.
I think that's the big thing for the Enemy Within, from what little I understand, right? Like, there's, like, it's been compared to Massive Nyarlathotep in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I think most people that run the game are it's investigating weird stuff that happens and throwing in some combat and role playing. I mean, although you could, do it as sort of like a deep culture game too, where you're just being a merchant or a beggar and and
a peddler.
And a peddler in a big city and trying to survive.
By selling spoons.
But I mean, I think there's just sort of this trend in fantasy, basically anything that's fantasy or sci-fi, but especially fantasy, of like just character progression, like, and Felix, to Warhammer Fantasy characters, Felix and Gotrek, like I've read the first several novels, and they start as down on their luck, sort of like wandering around looking for money to survive, and by the end of the novels, there are quite a few novels, they're like, fighting chaos gods or whatever, and just, finding incredibly powerful magical weapons and fighting off armies of demons. And, there's a bit of a power progression. And I just wonder how much of the role-playing game has that as well, because characters do get, once you get really high skills and the right talents, and you can be pretty powerful, I would imagine. So, you can go off and do that kind of thing, but again, because I think this again has its roots in British culture and British ideas of society, what you also do is you move up in status, and the type of adventures you have tend to change because you are dealing with richer and more powerful people, and people who have different types of resources and different types of adventures. If you want to take the campaign in that kind of direction, if you want to stay low level, as I tended to do, you can do that too. If you want to put all your points into getting better at fighting stuff, you can do that, and certainly there are adventures out there that will cater to you. But I think the game is kind of intending that you gain in social rank rather than combat rank. I mean, you're probably some combat rank as well, because you tend to start off not, there's a good chance you'll get your arms chopped off. So you'll end up at court or possibly involved in the politics of the elector counts. And this is a society, as the Holy Roman Empire was, where the emperor is elected. It's not a hereditary role, or not automatically hereditary by any means. And there's huge political jockeying, and at the same time you've got the
people that, the merchant kings down in Tilia, enormously rich, enormously vengeful, based on the Borgias and the Medicis and that infighting that goes on there. And yes, it can change the tone of the campaign if you want to take it in that direction, but as a way for a campaign not necessarily a campaign, but a game with recurring characters, or the same characters in an ongoing story, to change the tone, to change the direction as the characters grow and change, and grow older, and quite possibly grow tentacles as well. It's an interesting way to do that.
Grow older, grow wiser, grow tentacles.
I think we should put that on a T-shirt. Maybe the first Ludonarrative Dissonance T-shirt.
I think we're ready at why people play it this way. So yeah, I think James, you're the best to qualify. Why do people play Warhammer Fantasy?
I think because, with the exception of Zweihander, it's still not quite like anything else. Initially, people played it because they loved the battle game and they wanted to know more. And there was so much more in the rulebook, in the WFRP rulebook, certainly in the 80s and the 90s, than you could get from the battle game, because the battle game was about the armies and the warring states, and the role-playing game looked at the society that underlaid that. So there was the richness there, and you could run around in this society and do all kinds of fun stuff. And the Black Library pushed that on as well. There was this perception, I think there may still be, that Black Library novels are all about essentially the miniatures that you can buy and the kind of fights you're likely to get into in the game. And they weren't at all. My novels, I'll plug them, but I make no money off them. They're only long out of print. Mark of Damnation and Mark of Heresy are about a guy who starts off in the army, discovers a chaos cult, goes to report it, and finds himself very swiftly basically sidelined out of the army, and he can't quite work out why. And it's quite clearly because the roots of the cult lead upwards, not downwards. Essentially he becomes almost Delta Green. It's almost a Delta Green-like organization. It is an official organization, but it's so secret that most people refuse to believe it exists. And it's underfunded, and it's, and they're there to seek out the chaos cults and put them to fire and the sword. Huge fun to write. We did in the early bit, a number of people were talking about mud and cold and stuff. There is actually a chapter in the first one in which the central character spends an entire chapter in a forest at midnight, lying naked in freezing mud, feeling sorry for himself because his life has come to that. He has nothing. He has no status. He has no family anymore. He is just this body lying in this mud. And it's the point where he goes through the revelation and reinvents himself in that. I'm still proud of it as a piece of writing, but mostly I went to it just going, I want to do a chapter where he just lies in the freezing mud, because this is the most Warhammer experience that I can possibly think of for a player character. I don't think a player character would go through that, but a character within the world could go through that and come out of it stronger.
There's an element of masochism in this. Do you remember Midnight, the Midnight setting for D&D?
No.
Yes.
The What If Sauron won? So that's, sometimes you just want to be like, yeah, I'm just going to wallow in the fact that the whole world is rotten. And so I think that's one reason people play it. They play it because of the jokes, because you can laugh at the awfulness. They play it, I'm going to guess a lot of people enjoy not just the power fantasy, but sort of the moral purity fantasy. But it's not a pure moral purity fantasy. D&D is a moral purity fantasy, where it's like, oh, well, if, we are the lawful good paladins, and they are the chaotic evil orcs, and, there can be no compromise, and it's total war, and there's no complexity. Oh, yeah, stick it right in my eyes, the lack of nuance. Give me just pure black and white. And this is like, well, no, you're not, they're definitely pure evil, but you're not purely good. So this is your edgelord position of the morally gray versus the absolute moral velvety night sky black.
Yes, this is not a world of certainties.
Yeah.
It's also a world in which you may well have to become a monster in order to fight monsters. Or fighting monster will cause you to become a monster quite literally if you become infected by chaos.
Saw a dude with a tentacle, now I got a tentacle.
Well, I think, now that I think about it, like one of the appeal of Warhammer Fantasy is that it is actually a world that you can imagine how people actually live in it, as opposed to Dungeons and Dragons. Like Dungeons and Dragons, everything exists only in how adventurers perceive.
Yes, and to a large extent, it's set up to service. Where they've attempted to do some world building. It's a world that's set up
How do we
to service
justify the dungeon?
Adventuring heroes.
Yeah, and why are there dungeons? Well, this setting explains it this way, and this setting explains it this way, and this, everything is done in relation to the player characters. And Warhammer Fantasy is a world that exists regardless of the player characters, but they can exist within it, and they know that because there's a playable merchant class that there are merchants, that there's peddlers, there's beggars, there's river wardens and wreckers who rob who fight the river wardens.
It's a little bit like watching the Terra-centric model of the world shift to the heliocentric model of the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's, people used to think the world was the center of the universe and the sun rose and set around it. And that made people very comfortable because, we're the most important ones. We're right in the middle. And then when it became increasingly clear, no, actually the sun is the important thing and it's much bigger than the earth. And we are just one planet out of a number that are circling it. And people got upset about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But obviously Warhammer as a setting, fantasy has grown enormously in popularity within the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years. Not just because of the Black Library novels, but video games have actually played a huge part. And I have a lot of friends who now know about the fantasy setting because of games like Vermintide and Total Warhammer.
Yes, the Total War series those are just excellent.
Games Workshop are beginning to branch out into multimedia. They're bringing Warhammer Fantasy back because they realize Age of Sigmar has a fan base, but it's not Warhammer Fantasy because people actually like the rat catchers and the grave robbers and the peddlers and the beggars more than big guy in armor with magic powers fighting other big guy with magic powers and armor. Yeah, I think that's the appeal, is that it is in both ways very similar to D&D, but also a total contrast to D&D because it's an actual world. It's an actual setting. You can actually picture how it would work, how people live and breathe and exist. That's more. It's about a fantasy role playing and being able to immerse yourself in something.
And there are many, many roles that you can play, which will shift.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And once you get beyond the thrill of killing monsters and taking their stuff, you're kind of like, well, is this all there is to it? Well, yeah. Have you thought about being a rat catcher with a small vicious dog?
Did they keep the small vicious dog in? All right.
Yeah.
You gotta have it.
Big shout out to my friend Noah, who loves that career and used the image art for that in this book is quite amazing because the rat catcher, he does not skip arm day. He is quite got a lot of muscles, but also they have the small little dog.
Though as you move up
Page
through
66.
the character class, you can acquire a large and vicious dog.
Yeah.
Outstanding. All right. Well, I can't spare you this. You guys must have known this was coming.
Uh-huh.
I'm very disappointed that this has the future tense riddled throughout. When we were talking about Coyote and Crow, I'm like, it bothers me, but I can forgive it because this is the first game from a new company, and C7 has no excuse. They're better than this. They should not have, all these will strewn sentences. And I'm so tired of having to say this. I'm like, do I just give up? Am I the one who's wrong?
Greg,
should I just
let
the darkness take me?
Never allow the triumph of the will, Greg.
Oh no.
I think that's the best way to,
You've given me the strength to go on.
Aww. Yeah,
I just felt myself gain a fate point.
That's where the mutation sets root.
I think that's technically a resolve point in this.
Okay.
Yeah. So, any final words?
I will say that it is remarkably close to the first edition. If you've only ever played the first edition, you have fond memories of it, and you'd like to play something that has more up-to-date mechanics, if not necessarily more up-to-date attitudes to roleplay itself, you can just step straight into 4th edition. I have not actually sat down and worked out how easy it would be to take characters across, but probably not that hard. It feels like a very similar game in the same world with the same ethos behind it. And I think it keeps the same values, and it's still as strong as it was. It was the game that allowed Hogshead to succeed. It was our cash cow. And I took it on as a publishing project, never having played it. And then I played it and was like, oh, I'm so glad it's good. I'm so glad this is actually a game I like. So, yeah, I'm still enormously fond of it. I think 4th edition does it a great deal of justice. I think Don McDowell and Andy Law did a cracking job on this book. It looks great. It feels great. It communicates the Warhammer world in all its glory and lack of it. It is more finicky rules-wise, but it's still a hugely fun role-playing experience.
Hopefully someday I can actually play the actual system.
Set aside half a year for the Enemy Within campaign, Ross.
Yeah. I just gotta. Let me get a loan out, and I can possibly afford that. Let me mortgage something. What
you should do is we should have James run the Enemy Within for us.
Oh, I need to take out a mortgage. Have you seen what's happened to our mortgage rates in the last couple of weeks?
Only good things, right?
Yeah.
I thought those scrappy Tory outsiders were taking power to fix all the problems that had been done by scrappy Tory outsiders.
Do not get me started on the Tories.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's not. I shouldn't put a quarter in that jukebox.
Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you again to all our supporters for the Kickstarter. Our next episode is going to be Red Markets, which is going to be a very interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to that.
It should be
because it's a game I know very well. But yeah,
I'm new to it. We need to thank a couple of our Kickstarter backers as well, who backed at a superior tier for the joy of hearing their names read out on the podcast. And more than that, thank you so much. You make it possible for us to do this, and I am having so much fun with this. I suspect I speak for Greg and Ross as well.
Oh, yeah.
I need to personally thank Adam. Adam is his Kickstarter name, and we hope that he's happy to just be credited as Adam. If he would like to have his full name credited in a future episode, do just get in touch, and we will do that. If you are not the Adam concerned, please don't.
And I will say big thanks to Jeff Seiler. And that's Jeff with a G, so the fancy Jeff. The Warhammer the Warhammer Fantasy spelling of Jeff.
I had a small but vicious dog called Jeff once with a G.
Aww.
True story.
Aw. Well, again, thank you all. We'll talk to you later.
All right.